Guitar Co-op Podcasts. Great composers. Conceived and presented by Fabio Zanon. Schumann said that music owes as much to Bach as a religion to its founder. Brahms warned, "Study Bach, you will find everything there." When someone of the caliber of Schumann and Brahms says something like that, we should take it seriously. It is indisputable that Bach is one of the cultural icons of the West. It is also indisputable that he is the composer that all other composers admire and study. And amongst the greatest artists, he's the one who has most served to be the antecedent and the justification of what anyone else thinks. Just look at the literature on Bach. Here on the top of my table, I see some thick volumes with grand titles like Music in the Castle of Heaven, Bach and God, Bach and the Patterns of Invention, Bach and Posterity, Bach and the Meanings of Counterpoint. What surprises me the most is the degree of fanaticism that Bach inspires, not only among performers who devote their lives to playing and conducting predominantly or almost exclusively Bach's music. And there are countless examples, from Glenn Gould, Rosalind Turek, to Masaki Suzuki, Karl Richter, Gustav Leonhardt, and on the guitar, our beloved Paul Galbraith and Paolo Martelli. But there are students and listeners who feel completely satisfied with Bach's music, and only with it, losing the ability to admire any other music that is supposedly on a lower level, including that music of the contemporaries that Bach himself studied and admired. Bach belongs to that type of artist who creates a universe where we feel full and complete, an ecosystem where we can recognize the landscapes and learn how to move around. Entering the Bach planet is like doing without another planet, another solar system, another galaxy. He simply satisfies. It is a bit like playing chess. It's entering the Lord of Rings, binge-watching Harry Potter, living in search of lost time of Proust's, walking among Monet's haystacks. After this immersion, the boundary between the geometry of the work of art and our own subjectivity breaks down, and we, listeners and interpreters, feel that we are beginning to become that music. And surprisingly, this happens despite our cultural distance from a German man, white, heteronormative, staunchly Christian and Lutheran, who spent his entire life in small German courts and who died 275 years ago. There are qualities in Bach that are fanaticism prone. His music is obviously Baroque, obviously music linked to the court and to the established religion, and what he wrote had a purpose, whether for religious service or for teaching or for court usage, but it's unique. Even though it has elements that are similar to those of other composers such as Vivaldi, Telemann or Couperin, it is still much more similar to itself. Bach has managed, with a strong obsessive streak, to forge a language that combines the traditional scientific counterpoint from Northern Europe, the functionality of Italian harmony and French ornamental grace, in a whole in which none of the traits prevails over the others. This way, his music is monumentally complex and expressive at the same time. But Bach has another fanaticism-prone quality that resonates greatly with our postmodern sensibilities. His music has the tone of consolation. He seems to constantly assure us that there is a higher order, a relationship of cause, effect, and justice. That everything, in the end, is part of a higher plan and will be fine. And no wonder. Even if we consider life expectancy in his time that was very low and the infant mortality that was very high, his sensitivity was deeply marked by mourning. In the 1690s, a succession of close relatives died relatively young, including uncles and cousins who were musicians Sebastian admired. At the age of 9, he lost his mother. His father quickly remarried but also died 9 months later. The person who finished raising him was an older brother. As soon as he entered adolescence, he went to finish his studies in a city 400 kilometers away, which he had to travel on foot. Much is said about the 20 children that Bach had in 2 marriages. Yes, but out of these, only 10 survived childhood. His first wife left him with several children at the age of 35. At least one of his children, the one that misbehaved the most, died at the age of 24. Bach knew what it was like to lose a loved one and turn to God for understanding. But that was not all. Even at a time when court and church musicians were considered qualified servants, that is, there was no mystique surrounding the idea of genius or anything like that, he had to face difficulties in obtaining professional recognition that must have been a source of extreme frustration for someone who was probably the most privileged musical mind in history. He had to deal with bureaucrats who clearly had no estimate of his worth, and he had to accept restrictive jobs in which he had to fulfill his obligations under the dependence of inferior musicians. Often his contracts included not only composing, rehearsing, and giving music lessons to students of little aptitude, but also teaching Latin and catechism. From his first job as an organist in Arnstadt to his last as a music director in Leipzig, he had to deal with intrigues and complaints about the overcomplication of his music. When he was hired in Leipzig, his superiors told him that since they had not managed to attract the musician they wanted, that was Telemann, they would have to do with somebody mediocre. It's nice to learn that Bach and Telemann were actually friends. Telemann was the godfather of Bach's second son. Bach's biography is unique. Unique in the sense that it has almost no spectacular events. Bach is GuitarCoop's composer of the month of March. He was born on the 21st in Eisenach in 1685. Germany at the time was a group of independent states. In Thuringia, the name Bach was used almost as an equivalent for musician. In about 200 years, there are around 80 professional musicians who are direct relatives of Johann Sebastian, including his father, brothers, and sons. Well, this is one pillar of his life. The other is that Eisenach was one of the centers of Lutheranism. Sebastian studied at the same elementary school as Martin Luther. When Luther was persecuted for his attempts at the reform, he hid in the old castle of Eisenach for 10 months. That is where he translated the New Testament from Greek into German. Being a Lutheran and a musician for Bach was the same thing, as natural as eating or walking. Two things that he did both with gusto, by the way. He was a good student in all subjects and seems to have had an overwhelming curiosity. Despite his brother's prohibition, due to the high cost of music paper, he copied the collection of scores in secret and by moonlight. Being a competent violinist and a good choir singer, he saw his skills as an organist as the quickest way to earn living on his own. At the age of 18, he was already invited to give technical opinions on new organs. During his first job in Arnstadt, he made a 15-day trip that was more than 400 kilometers on foot, with empty pockets, to listen to famous organists like Reinken and Buxtehude. Sebastian held successive working posts in Weimar, Arnstadt, Mühlhausen, and Weimar again. Even as a young man, he got into fights with other musicians and students because he considered them incompetent. However, these courts employed Italian musicians and French dancers, which broadened his cultural horizons. Without ever leaving a radius of 500 kilometers, Bach acquired a completely international musical culture. He also married his cousin Maria Barbara, with whom he had 7 children, 4 of whom survived, and 2, Wilhelm Friedemann and Carl Philipp, became distinguished composers. Bach's contracts reflect the living conditions in 18th century Germany. He received often parts of his pay in wheat, wine, beer, and other consumer goods. Always dissatisfied with his working conditions, he tried to force his resignation in Weimar, which earned him a month in jail. In 1717, at the age of 32, he was hired by the Calvinist court of Köthen. This was the only period of his career in which he did not have obligations towards the church, and this was the period, not surprisingly, in which he wrote most instrumental music, including famous works like the Brandenburg concertos and the sonatas and suites for violin and cello, which are extremely important for guitarists, as I will show later. In 1720, when he was away at work, his wife died suddenly. He received the news only when he returned home, when she was already buried. A year later, he met and married Anna Magdalena, a singer 16 years his junior. With her, he had 13 more children, 6 of whom reached adulthood. 2 of them, Johann Christian and Johann Christoph, also became famous composers. It's well worth remembering that all of Bach's musical children had much more successful careers than the father. In 1723, Bach finally landed at his last position in Leipzig. There, he had to teach at a boys' school in St. Thomas Church and produce music for no less than 4 churches. Many people wonder why Bach settled down to work in a city whose authorities he called tightwads, and where he was a pawn in a fierce political dispute that created, in his words, only hindrance and vexation. But Leipzig was an important capital with a large university where all his children studied. He himself resented the fact that he didn't have a university degree and had lost professional opportunities because of that. It seems that the musical profession hasn't changed much since. The last notable event in his later years was the visit he made to Frederick II of Prussia in Potsdam, where his son Carl Philipp was already working. The improvisations he made on the theme proposed by the king were later expanded into the work now called Musical Offer. Bach died at the age of 65 in 1750. At that time, his sons were already more recognized or operated in a different static key, that of the galant style, simpler and more expressive than their father's circumspect Lutheranism. Carl Philipp especially truly adored his father. He collaborated in writing his biography and preserved much of his work. Many people say that Bach wrote in an outdated style. It's not so much that, it's more that he wrote music that could satisfy his own intellectual demands. He couldn't get used to music that was less complex, less scientific. Leipzig is a good starting point for us to understand a little about Bach the artist. His music was totally filtered by his Lutheran education. His life's artistic ambition was to regulate church music for the supreme glory of God. Luther understood that the word appealed to the intellect, but music to the emotions. His hymnal even include popular songs. He did not want good music to serve the devil. Bach knew devotional music literally backwards and upside down, and these are the building blocks of his work. In Leipzig, his main responsibility was to write music for religious services, which gave him the opportunity to finally meet his higher calling. Cantatas were originally a modest Italian musical genre that, when adopted by the Lutheran Church, became a kind of musical mammoth. They would typically be sung during the long religious Sunday services, between the reading of the word and the sermon, lasting about 20 to 30 minutes, and ending with a chorale that would be joined in with the congregation. Bach's music was so good that between the two churches that play his music, he had about 9,000 listeners every week out of a population of 30,000 people. So he could really bring the word to as many people as he could reach. Bach composed, rehearsed, and performed no fewer than 5 cycles of cantatas, one for each week of the calendar. About 200 of them have survived. That means that about 100 have been lost forever. In addition, during this period, he also wrote 2 monuments of Western culture, the 2 Passions according to St. John and St. Matthew. These are works where he follows the Gospels word for word in the episodes of the Passion and Crucifixion of Christ. They were written to be presented during Holy Week. It was believed that he had written all those works spread along the 27 years he lived in Leipzig. But that was apparently not the case. Recent studies of the manuscripts show us that most of these works were composed in the first 3 years after his arrival. There are hundreds of hours of music. How this man managed to maintain this level of creativity under pressure is one of the greatest miracles in art history. Three years before his death, Bach joined the Select Society for Musical Sciences. It was a brotherhood of composers to which Handel and Telemann also belonged, who regarded music as a science. One of his obligations was to submit a kind of scientific work, a kind of riddle for the other members to enjoy, until the age of 65. Bach submitted his incredible canonic variations for the organ. What is counterpoint? Well, it's the art of interweaving melodies that created a texture in which they become an accompaniment to themselves. They imitate and escape from each other, often using devices such as augmentation or diminution of the duration of the notes, or being played or sung backwards or from top to bottom, following very strict rules of writing. Many of the works of his last decade, such as the Goldberg Variations, The Art of Fugue, and the Musical Offer, seem to have been made as a self-imposed intellectual challenge, in which Bach seems to tell us in Latin, ars est artem celere, that is, the true skill is to hide the skill. In his later years, Bach seems to have developed a feeling that was only found among architects or sculptors, the need to make his work last for posterity, and in his case, to leave the best possible image of his talent. He dedicated an unusual amount of time rearranging and copying many of his youthful works. For example, he had written the Well-Tempered Clavier in 1722. These are 24 highly complex preludes and fugues in all major and minor keys. Well, in 1740, he wrote another 24, even more complex and interesting than those in the first volume. He also organized many of his scattered compositions into collections of six partitas, 6 French suites, 6 English suites. also revised a good part of the organ chorales he had written in his youth. How does the guitar fit into all this? And how is Bach represented in GuitarCoop's discography? Well, we know that the guitar, as we understand today, did not exist in Bach's time. The instrument that belonged to the musical scenario at that time was the lute, complemented by similar instruments such as the theorbo and the chitarrone. Bach knew the lute well, and he was friends with well-known lutenists of the time, such as Weiss and Krebs. In all, he left 5 major works attributed to the lute, in addition to 2 shorter pieces. But the question remains, did he really write for the lute, and did he write anything else for the lute? Well, we don't have an answer to the second question. The first is easier. Many of these works probably had a keyboard instrument in mind. Let's look at them one by one. First, the Suite BWV 995. There is a version for the lute, a real lute for the suite, which is originally written for the cello. There's still some doubt about which one came first, but at least this one has a version that is unequivocally written for the lute. GuitarCoop proudly presents Paul Galbraith's exceptional recording of this work, which allows it to be played in its original form on an 8-string guitar. Next comes another suite, BWV 996, a very fast-paced piece that seems to be a work from his youth. That one is written in the French style and clearly written for the Lautenwerk, or harpsichord lute, an instrument that only survives in drawings. It was a kind of small harpsichord with a much smaller body, more delicate and fewer keys, and also a portable instrument. The clamp system was softer, muffled, and covered with leather, and that produced a very soft sound similar to that of the lute. In other words, it is an easier piece than his harpsichord suites, but clearly written for the keyboard. Paul Galbraith has also recorded the second movement for GuitarCoop on his album Allemande. Next work is the suite in C minor BWV 997. It comes in 2 versions. One is written for a keyboard and the other written not by Bach for the lute. It is a somber, introspective work. Its main ideas use a descending bass line that recalls the chorale Jesu meine Freude, that is, Jesus my joy. Two lute works bring da capo fugues. What are da capo fugues? They are fugues where the first section is repeated after the second one is played. This fugue of the 997 has even received a theological interpretation, drawing a parallel between the musical content and the idea of temptation, fall, and salvation. Marcelo Caldas has recorded this work for GuitarCoop. Everyone loves the Prelude Fugue and Allegro BWV 998. Many people think that it is paired with the previous suite because not only they have parallels in form, like the da capo fugue, but they are also in relative keys, C minor in the first and E flat major this one. Much of the material is reminiscent of the chorale Herr Jesu Christ war Mensch und Gott, Lord Jesus Christ, who was man and God at once. The next two works, 999 and the BWV 1000, are a prelude and a fugue independent from each other, clearly for the lute, which also have versions for the keyboard and for the solo violin. They also sound very good on the guitar, and Paolo Martelli has recorded the fugue. Finally, this partita in E major, BWV 1006A, it is a version of the same work for solo violin. It's a mysterious work because it is not very lute-friendly, but it also does not seem to be keyboard music. I have the idea that it might be a draft that was written in order to provide a professional lute player with material to make a version for the lute. All these works, attributes for the lute, have been played by guitarists for the past 100 years. The first edition was made in Germany in the 1920s by Hans Dagobert Brugger. This was the source for all guitarists of the time, starting with Segovia and Agustín Barrios. Before that, starting with Tárrega, there was already a habit of making adaptations of violin and cello works. The 6 violin solos are another essential collection. Bach created a way of writing works with a very dense texture for small 4-string instruments and a single bow. As if the technical challenge of these compositions were not enough, they also have an enormous expressive power. Zoran Dukic explores some of the darker movements of these works. The solo violin works were collected in a manuscript dated 1720, that is exactly the year Bach's first wife died. For this reason, some scholars want to see in these works a manifestation of mourning, reinforced by the use of harmonies taken from Lutheran chorales, whose content expresses anguish. I find the idea interesting and plausible, although there is no evidence. One of the most beautiful recordings of GuitarCoop was made by Julia Trinchuk, and it is that of the Sonata BWV 1005. The mature Bach owns such a complete mastery of the art of composition that the hymns he sang and played throughout his life in church emerged transformed in his imagination, And this happens in almost all of the works of his maturity. The vortex of this collection of 6 violin solos is the last movement of the 4th piece, the famous Chacona. It is a solemn dance in the form of variations on a mournful bass line. Andrés Segovia's transcription from the 1930s represent a huge leap in musical scope for the guitar repertoire. It is a turning point, actually, in the history of the instrument and a mountain that every guitarist wants to climb. It can be heard on 3 GuitarCoop releases. One is played by the duo of Aniello Desiderio and Zoran Dukic in a version for 2 guitars based on Busoni's transcription. The other is a solo version played by the Aniello Desiderio and also a video played by Annabelle Montesinos. Solo violin works are very dense and varied, so they are easier to transcribe for the guitar. The 6 suites for cello present a different problem. Their form is very uniform, and the writing, due to the difficulty of the cello itself, is much more economical. Anyone who writes a version for the guitar is always tempted to fill in the gaps, as Bach himself certainly did when he played them on the keyboard. That was even documented by his student Agricola. They have been in our repertoire since the 1950s. Tárrega's arrangement and the Chacon played by Segovia are undoubtedly landmarks in the history of the guitar. Also is the recording of All Suites by John Williams. But since then, transcriptions of complex works for the keyboard have become more frequently, especially those made by David Russell, Joseph Oetvos, and Hubert Keppel. The outcome of this devotion to Bach was the adoption of multi-stringed instruments by guitarists such as Goran Zolcher, Narciso Yepes, Paul Galbraith, and Paolo Martelli. It is a case in point where the content of the music prompted an evolution of the very shape of the instrument. GuitarCoop is proud to offer brilliant recordings by Paolo Martelli and Paul Galbraith. Mendelssohn, a Jewish composer whose career was propelled by Bach's music, once said, "What I appreciate most about Bach is his ability to suggest what it feels like to believe in God. His music seems to me to be about devotion to a perfect ideal, something purer, better and higher. Cellist Pablo Casals described Bach's music as a rediscovery of the world of which I am so happy to be a part. It fills me with an awareness of the wonder of life, with a sense of the incredible wonder of being a human being. Composer Villa-Lobos wrote that Bach's music is without a doubt the most sacred gift to the world of art, and Chopin said that Bach is like an astronomer who, aided by numbers, discovers the most beautiful stars. There is a religious streak in this devotion, which is perhaps best summarized by Bartók. It may be that not all composers believe in God, but all, however, believe in Bach. That's it. Bach's music, based on a rigorous technique, which springs from a model of thought similar to that of a scientist, generates an abstract expressiveness that is read as a reflection of the order of nature. This devotion is a kind of aesthetic pantheism. For those who are linked to some kind of religious devotion, Bach is a confirmation, a fifth gospel. For those who are not, he captures the sensation of this religious feeling in a secular context. I hope you have enjoyed this episode. GuitarCoop is very proud to have in its catalog lots of Bach recordings on the guitar, and we have prepared a nice playlist for you to hear after hearing this podcast. So you just have to follow GuitarCoop's channels so you can hear both the podcast and the playlists. Next month, the composer of the month will be the great Baroque guitarist from Spain, Gaspar Sanz. Until then, have a great time. Ciao! GuitarCoop Podcasts. Great composers. Conceived and presented by Fabio Zanon.